Today I'm showing you how to copy a store-bought boys tank to make your own using an upcycled tee. You'll need all of the sewing basics like pins, scissors, and a machine. You'll also need a tank to copy plus a larger t-shirt. And you need to change the needle in your machine to either a ballpoint or a stretch needle. I'm also going to use a ballpoint twin needle, which is optional. First, you want to fold the tee you're cutting up in half lengthwise and smooth it out, making sure there are no wrinkles. Do the same for the tank you're using as a pattern and lay it on top. You need to make sure there are no wrinkles before you start pinning through all the layers. And if it's easier, you can lay them both out flat and do it that way, but folding in half ensures a symmetrical pattern piece. Pin all the way around through all the layers, then cut, leaving yourself a seam allowance. For the sides and armholes, I left a 1/4 inch, and for the hem, I cut about a 1/2 inch away from my original t-shirt. I could have used the original t-shirt hem, but I like my hems to go all the way around rather than being caught in the side seams. For the neckline, I cut right up against the binding on the original store-bought tank top. And then once I took all the pieces apart, I cut away, another 1/2 inch from the neckline of the back of the shirt, and then as deep as about 3 inches from the neckline of the front of the shirt piece. That's because I'm going to be adding binding to the neckline of the tank I'm making, just like on the store-bought tee. For the arms though, I'm actually going to hem it with a double needle like a tank top he had when he was younger, whereas the store-bought tank has binding. I'm not going to be putting binding on my new tank. You also need to harvest the binding from the neckline of the larger t-shirt. Now, I hate using seam rippers on knit, so I just cut away as close to the original seam as I could, but you could use a seam ripper if you're patient enough. That also involved pulling out some of the old t-shirt and just in general cutting away and making it look a little nicer and uniform, all the same width. Now the first step is to lay your 2 pattern pieces for the new tank top right sides together, and we're going to stitch up one shoulder only. Do not stitch up both shoulders. My preference is the narrow zigzag. That's what I like better than the stretch stitch and the loose tension straight stitch, so that's what I'm going to be using. Use whatever you're comfortable with. There are no sewing police around here. Nobody's going to be looking and judging, and so use what you want to use. I'm going for the narrow zigzag. So stitch up one shoulder, and you can top stitch that seam down if you want. And now we're going to place the neckline binding right sides together on the outside of the tank. So put the raw edges together and put the binding on the outside of the tank. Stitch it down and slightly pull the ribbing as you sew along the neckline. And then when you get to the end, there will probably be some excess ribbing that you can go ahead and snip away, just like I'm doing here. And now you can go ahead and stitch up the other shoulder seam and do just like you did before, top stitching down the seam allowance. Again, I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance pretty much everywhere. That's what I like to use for knits. Everybody's different. Okay, so now your neckline is finished and your shoulder seams are finished. Next step, we're going to stitch down the sides of the tank with, again, a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That's what I'm using. Use what you want and what'll fit your child. And then we're going to go ahead and switch to the twin needle. I am anyway. If you don't have a twin needle, you don't have to. If you did not harvest the hem from the original t-shirt, you can go ahead and stitch up the hem of your tank using probably about a 1/2 inch is what I used. And again, with my twin needle, so it looks a little more ready to wear. And then I'm going to go ahead and stitch up the armholes using the same seam allowance. This looks just like a tank he had when he was younger. It used this double needle hem on the arms instead of the binding. And really, you can use binding here if you want. Just remember to cut a little bit of extra away from the armhole seams, and then also harvest some extra binding. I just didn't have enough binding. That's why I decided to use the twin needle here and do that for both arms. And finally, I'm going to top stitch around the neckline in the seam allowance of where we sewed the binding to the t-shirt. And that's just, again, to give it a little bit more of have a ready to wear look. And we're done, and my son has a new tank top now. It is camo, and I have tons of these camo t-shirts, so you always see these popping up on my blog. And I actually have one more project planned with these camo t-shirts. So let me know if you make one, or if you do it differently, how do you do it? Thanks for watching, and you can always check out my channel, Spool School. Bye!